Every place you've ever loved is still speaking. Most of us just don't know how to listen. This is The Stories We Keep by History Loves Company, a podcast about the homes, streets, buildings, and places that shaped us, and what happens when we choose to remember them or forget them. Here, we don't just talk about architecture. We talk about the lives that unfolded inside it. The quiet moments, the celebrations, the losses, and the generations that came before us. Because long after a building is altered, abandoned, or erased, its story doesn't disappear. It waits. And this is where we keep it. Have you ever stood somewhere in Michigan and felt like the place was trying to tell you something? Not in a dramatic way. Not like a ghost story. More like a whisper. A feeling that the land remembered what we don't. A street that feels wider than it needs to be. A tree line that seems too deliberate. A foundation in the grass behind a school. A crumbling staircase that leads to nowhere. And the strange part is, most people walk right past it. Because history rarely disappears loudly. It fades. It gets covered up. It gets repainted. It gets renamed. It gets demolished and replaced with something practical. It gets turned into a parking lot, or an empty field, or a building that looks like it could be anywhere. But even when the building is gone, the story doesn't always leave. It lingers in the shape of a neighborhood, in the weird angle of an intersection, in the way a house sits back from the road like it used to have neighbors, in a church that feels too grand for its block, in a downtown that looks like it once expected more of itself. And Michigan is full of places like that. Detroit, Pontiac, Flint, Saginaw, Bay City, Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor, Birmingham, Traverse City. Small towns with one historic street that still holds on. Places where you can feel the past, even if you can't name it. And that feeling, that subtle pull, that quiet, almost embarrassing urge to slow down and wonder. That's what this podcast is built on. Because I've learned something over the years. The people who feel that pull usually become the people who save what's left. Not always with money, not always with power, sometimes just by paying attention, by noticing the details, by asking questions, by taking a photo, by telling someone, hey, did you know this used to be something? This podcast is for those people, the ones who can't help but look twice. My name is Chris Hubble. I'm a Michigan realtor. I specialize in historic homes, and I'm the creator of History Loves Company, a storytelling brand built around one belief. Every home is a story, and if someone doesn't tell it, it disappears. I've spent years walking through Michigan, through Detroit neighborhoods, Pontiac streets, small towns, lakeside communities, filming places that still carry the fingerprints of the people who built them. Some of these places are beautifully restored. Some are barely holding on. Some are already gone, and the only thing left is a photo, or a rumor, or a memory from someone's grandparent. But every single one of them matters, because Michigan's story is bigger than people think. We're not just the auto state. We're not just the Great Lakes state. Michigan is a place where entire cities rose quickly, sometimes almost overnight. And when wealth arrives that fast, people build fast. They build neighborhoods. They build churches. They build schools. They build grand civic buildings. They build mansions for the elite. They build bungalows for workers. They build cottages by the lakes. And it all becomes a physical record of a century of ambition. But then, the world changes. Industry shifts. Jobs move. Freeways cut through neighborhoods. Downtowns hollow out. Communities disinvest. Buildings burn. Buildings are demolished. Streets are widened. History is renamed. And what's left behind isn't just vacancy, it's evidence. Evidence of what Michigan believed about itself at its peak. And if you care about Michigan, if you care about Detroit, Pontiac, any of it, you have to care about the evidence. Because it tells you what we did right, and it tells you what we did wrong, and it tells you what we might be able to do again. let me tell you what this podcast is going to do. This is not a show where we just list dates and recite names like a textbook. This is a show where we visit places, in our minds and sometimes in person, and we ask, who built this? Why here? What did it mean at that time? What happened to it? And what does it mean now? Sometimes we'll explore a mansion in Detroit that vanished under a freeway. Sometimes we'll talk about a forgotten neighborhood in Pontiac and why its street still holds clues to what it used to be. Sometimes we'll go to a small Michigan town where one Victorian home still stands like a time capsule that refused to die. Sometimes we'll talk about tunnels, buried rivers, institutional basements, old schools, churches, factories, and yes, sometimes we'll talk about ghosts. Not the Hollywood kind, the real kind. The way a place can feel haunted because it held so much life and then suddenly didn't. And when we tell these stories, we're not doing it to romanticize the past. We're doing it because the past is still shaping the present. In Michigan, especially, you can't understand today without understanding what came before. And I want to be clear about something. This isn't just content for me. I'm a realtor. Historic homes are my work. They're my day-to-day reality. I sit at kitchen tables with buyers who are trying to decide whether they can handle a 100-year-old house. I work with sellers who are saying goodbye to a home that has held their family for decades. I walk through houses where you can feel the craft in every detail, where the door handles still work after a century, where the floors creak in the same place they did in 1910, where the light hits stained glass in a way modern windows simply don't replicate. And I can tell you this, people don't fall in love with historic homes logically. They fall in love with them emotionally. And once they feel it, they're changed. They start noticing other places. They start caring more. They start seeing their city differently. And that shift is how preservation starts. Not with committees, not with grants, not with policies, with people, with feeling, with connection. So here's the promise of this podcast. If you stay with me, I'm going to take you across Michigan, through cities you think you know, and places you've never heard of. And I'm going to show you how to see, how to look at the buildings and understand what it's trying to tell you, how to read a neighborhood like it's a document, how to walk a street and see time layered in the architecture. And when we're done, Michigan won't feel like just a place you live. It'll feel like a story you belong to. Now, before we get into the deep history, I want you to do one thing. Think of one place, one building, one home, one street, one piece of Michigan that you feel connected to. It can be anywhere. Detroit, Pontiac, a small town up north, a neighborhood you grew up in. Hold it in your mind. Because as we build this story, I want you to realize something. Your story belongs here too. These are not just my stories. These are ours. History loves company. And these are the stories we keep. To understand why Michigan is filled with grand homes, oversized neighborhoods, and buildings that feel almost overbuilt, you have to understand one thing. Michigan didn't grow slowly. Michigan arrived. Most of the oldest cities in America had centuries to evolve. Streets narrowed over time. Buildings layered on top of buildings. Homes adapted gradually. Michigan didn't have that luxury. Michigan developed during a moment in history when the country was expanding fast. Capital was moving quickly, and confidence was high. And when confidence meets opportunity, people build big. It starts with geography. Michigan is surrounded by water. Not just water. The Great Lakes. Freshwater highways. Before interstates. Before air travel. Before modern trucking. The lakes were everything. They moved lumber. They moved iron ore. They moved finished goods. They moved people. And wherever those routes touched land, cities formed. Detroit, Pontiac, Bay City, Saginaw, Muskegon, Grand Rapids, Holland, Traverse City. These weren't sleepy villages. They were industrial outposts that grew into cities almost overnight. And when cities grow that fast, architecture becomes a form of certainty. A way to say, we're here. We've made it. This is permanent. Before automobiles reshaped the world, Michigan's first great fortune came from lumber. By the mid-1800s, Michigan was one of the largest lumber producers in the world. Entire forests were cut, floated down rivers, loaded into ships, and shipped to growing cities across the country. That money didn't disappear. It landed in houses, in churches, in civic buildings, in schools. That's why you'll find ornate Victorian homes in places that feel unexpectedly grand for their size. Small towns with carved porches, stained glass, elaborate roof lines, brickwork that feels almost excessive. These weren't accidents. These were lumber fortunes, made fast and invested locally. Then came manufacturing. Furniture in Grand Rapids, carriages, machinery, tools. Before Michigan built cars, it built the parts of the industrial world. And again, when people succeeded, they built homes that reflected it. Not subtle homes. Homes that announced arrival. And then, the automobile changed everything. But here's what's important. Detroit did not invent the automobile in isolation. Detroit already had skilled labor, factories, capital, transportation infrastructure, a culture of building. The auto industry didn't create Michigan's architecture, it accelerated it. Suddenly, wealth wasn't just flowing, it was exploding. Executives, engineers, designers, suppliers, they all needed housing, and not just housing, status housing. Neighborhoods were planned intentionally. Street widths mattered, setbacks mattered, tree placement mattered, lot size mattered. because a neighborhood wasn't just a collection of houses, it was a brand. This is where Michigan became unique. Unlike older East Coast cities, many Michigan neighborhoods were built in a very narrow window of time. 10 years, 15 years, sometimes less. That means entire districts share a cohesive architectural identity. You can walk a street and feel like it was built in one breath. Boston Edison, Indian Village, Brush Park, Heritage Hill, Old West Side Ann Arbor, Corktown, downtown Pontiac's early neighborhoods. These weren't organic accidents. They were deliberate. Developers hired architects. Architects set standards. Builders followed pattern books. Cities enforced setbacks. This was city building, not just construction. But here's the other part of the story. Michigan didn't just build mansions. It built layers. For every executive estate, there was a worker bungalow. For every grand boulevard, there were side streets filled with modest homes. For every mansion district, there was a neighborhood built for teachers, factory workers, clerks, and shop owners. This matters because Michigan's architecture tells a full social story. Not just wealth at the top, but aspiration in the middle. Craftsman homes, colonials, four squares, duplexes, built well, built to last, built with pride. That's why even modest Michigan neighborhoods often feel solid, because they were. And then, almost without warning, the conditions that built all of this began to change. Forests were depleted, industries consolidated, jobs centralized, transportation shifted, and perhaps, most importantly, the idea of progress changed. Old began to mean obsolete. Large began to mean inefficient. Ornate began to mean dated. Maintenance began to feel like a burden. And Michigan, which had built so much, so quickly, now had to decide what to do with it all. That decision is where this story turns. Because a state built on permanence suddenly faced impermanence. And not everyone was ready for that. This is the tension that defines Michigan's built history. On one hand, extraordinary craftsmanship, ambitious scale, purposeful neighborhoods. On the other, economic shifts, policy decisions, cultural taste changes, disinvestment, neglect. The same speed that allowed Michigan to build would later make it vulnerable. And nowhere is that more visible than in the homes and neighborhoods we'll talk about next. In the next section, we're going to start walking through specific places, not just Detroit, but across Michigan. We'll talk about why some homes became symbols, why others were forgotten, why certain neighborhoods held on, and why others collapsed almost entirely. And as we do, I want you to keep one idea in mind. Michigan's architecture is not just about its past. It's a roadmap. It shows us what worked, what failed, and what kind of places we're capable of building again. There's a moment in every growing city when houses stop being just places to live. They become symbols, not just of wealth, but of confidence, of arrival, of identity. Michigan reached that moment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And when it did, homes began carrying meaning far beyond their walls. You can feel it when you stand in front of one. Even today, some houses still command attention, long after the families who built them are gone. They sit back from the street differently. They hold space. They seem aware of themselves. They weren't built quietly. They were built to say something. Let's start in Detroit. Not because Detroit is the only story, but because it was the loudest one. Detroit's early mansion culture didn't emerge randomly. It followed power, and power followed geography. Brush Park was not tucked away. It was positioned. just north of downtown, close enough to be connected, far enough to feel exclusive. This mattered. In the late 1800s, Detroit's elite wanted proximity to their businesses, to the river, to the center of the city, but they also wanted separation. Brush Park offered both. Developers laid out wide streets. Lots were generous. Homes were oriented to face one another as if in conversation, and the architecture, it was unapologetic. Second Empire mansions, Victorian palaces, turrets, iron cresting, stonework that felt imported rather than local. These homes were not designed to blend in. They were designed to impress, and they worked. Brush Park became a shorthand for success. If you lived there, people knew exactly what that meant. But Brush Park was not alone. Across Michigan, other places were doing the same thing, in different ways, for different reasons. If Brush Park was about proximity, East Jefferson was about presence. These homes faced the river. They caught breeze. They commanded views. They signaled permanence. Riverfront land has always meant something. It means trade, movement, connection. And the families who built here wanted that symbolism attached to their names. Mansions along East Jefferson weren't just residences. They were announcements. I belong to the future of this city. Now let's pull back, because Detroit wasn't the only place where homes became symbols. Pontiac's story is quieter, but just as revealing. Pontiac sat at a crossroads, close to Detroit, but independent. Commercially active, industrial connected, civically proud, and Pontiac's homes reflect that. Here, you don't see endless rows of mansions. Instead, you see strategic placement, large homes near downtown, stately residences along key corridors, neighborhoods built to support merchants, professionals, and civic leaders. Pontiac's historic homes weren't about outshining Detroit. They were about anchoring a city. If Detroit's mansions said, "Look how big we are," Pontiac said, "Look how solid we are." And that distinction matters, because it shaped how each city weathered change. Now let's move west. In Grand Rapids, wealth spoke differently. This was a city of furniture makers, artisans, manufacturers who valued detail. Here, homes weren't always massive, but they were meticulous. Woodwork mattered, proportions mattered, design mattered. A Grand Rapids home might not tower over its neighbors, but if you looked closely, you could see the care. This is where the arts and crafts movement found fertile ground, and the homes built here reflected values as much as wealth. Craftsmanship became status. Then there are the small towns, places people often overlook. In many Michigan towns, there wasn't room or need for dozens of mansions, but there was often one house that stood out: the lumber baron's home, the mill owner's residence, the doctor's estate. Built slightly higher, set back just a little more, finished with extra care. And for decades, that house became part of the town's identity. People gave directions using it. They referenced it casually. "Oh, by the big house." When those homes disappeared, something subtle changed. The town didn't fall apart, but it lost a reference point. And without reference points, memory becomes fragile. What all of these places share is intention. These homes were not speculative builds. They weren't thrown up quickly. They were designed with the assumption that they would still be standing long after their builders were gone, which makes what happened next so difficult to reconcile. Here's the hard truth. The very qualities that made these homes symbols also made them vulnerable. Large, conspicuous, expensive to maintain. As taste changed, these homes stopped representing success. They started representing the past. And in America, especially in the mid-20th century, the past was something to escape. Modernism arrived. Efficiency became the goal. Small became smart. New became good. Old became inconvenient. Homes that once symbolized arrival were suddenly labeled outdated. And once a symbol loses its meaning, it becomes expendable. This is where the story begins to fracture. Because some homes adapted, some neighborhoods organized, some cities protected what they had, and others didn't. In the next section, we're gonna slow down even more. We're gonna walk inside specific homes, room by room, decision by decision, and talk about what happened when these symbols began to fall. We'll talk about conversion, abandonment, fire, demolition, and silence. Because loss doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages. And once you recognize those stages, you'll start seeing them everywhere. Let's keep going. Most people imagine that historic homes are lost in dramatic moments. A wrecking ball, a fire, a news headline. But that's almost never how it actually happens. Great homes don't usually disappear suddenly. They unravel. Slowly, quietly, predictably. And once you learn the pattern, you can see it everywhere. The first stage is almost always departure, not abandonment, just leaving. The original family moves on. Sometimes it's for opportunity. Sometimes it's for convenience. Sometimes it's because the city has changed in ways that no longer feel comfortable. The house is still cared for, still heated, still intact, but something has shifted. The people who built it are no longer there to fight for it, and no one loves a house quite like the people who built it. The second stage is adaptation. This is where most historic homes begin to change in subtle ways. A mansion becomes a duplex. A grand residence becomes offices. A single-family home becomes a rooming house. Walls go up. Fireplaces are sealed. Staircases are altered. Servant quarters become storage. At first, these changes feel practical, necessary. The house is still being used, still occupied, still standing, but it is no longer being respected as a whole. And architecture, like memory, does not like to be fragmented. The third stage is deferred care. This is where the real damage begins. Historic homes are not forgiving. They're strong, but they require attention. Roof leaks become interior damage. Gutters clog. Water enters. Plaster cracks. Wood swells. And once water finds a way in, it does not leave quietly. Deferred maintenance isn't malicious. It's usually financial, or logistical, or emotional. It's the slow realization that this house is bigger than its current owner can reasonably manage. And when that realization sets in, people stop fixing things properly. They patch, they delay, they hope. The fourth stage is vacancy. This is the tipping point. Once a historic home is vacant, the clock starts ticking. Vacant homes attract attention, not the good kind. Scrappers, trespassers, weather, animals. Windows break. Copper disappears, doors are forced, and every intrusion accelerates the decline. At this point, the house is no longer deteriorating, it's being consumed. Now let's talk about what this looked like in real places. Brush Park did not fall overnight. It was dismantled, one house at a time. As residents left, mansions were subdivided, converted into apartments, then into rooming houses. The neighborhood's original design, which relied on cohesion and proximity, began to fracture. Once a few homes declined, others followed. vacancy clustered. And once vacancy clusters, entire blocks become vulnerable. By the 1970s and 80s, Brush Park was no longer seen historic. It was seen as expendable. And expendable neighborhoods rarely survive. Along East Jefferson, the unraveling came from a different force. Freeways. Highways don't just remove buildings. They isolate the ones that remain. Noise replaces quiet. Traffic replaces walkability. Property values drop. Families leave. Once prestigious homes suddenly sit next to concrete walls and constant vibration. Even homes that weren't demolished lost their reason to exist. And when a home loses its context, it becomes an orphan. In small Michigan towns, the unraveling is often quieter. There may be one large home. The family moves away. No comparable buyer exists. The house sits, not abandoned, but waiting. Years pass, the town changes, and eventually, someone asks a dangerous question. What are we supposed to do with this? That question, when unanswered, often leads to demolition. Not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion. Now we need to talk about fire, because fire played a role that cannot be ignored. Some fires were accidental. Old wiring, neglect, weather damage. Others were not. Insurance fires, arson, destruction for sport. Historic homes burn differently. They burn hot. Old growth lumber, dense materials, thick framing. When they go completely. And once a home burns, its fate is sealed. Even if walls remain, officials see danger, and danger justifies demolition. But here's the hardest part. Many of these homes could have been saved. Not all of them, but more than we realize. They weren't lost because they were impossible. They were lost because there was no system in place to catch them early. No preservation framework, no incentives, no urgency. And once a city becomes overwhelmed, loss accelerates. This is the moment where people often say, well, that was inevitable. But inevitability is often just a story we tell ourselves after the fact. Because while some places unraveled, others didn't. Some neighborhoods organized. Some residents fought. Some cities chose preservation over erasure. And that's where this story turns again. In the next section, we're going to talk about systems, freeways, redlining, policy decisions. Not emotionally, but structurally. Because to understand why so many homes were lost, we have to look at the forces that made loss easier than preservation. And once you see those forces, you'll start recognizing them in cities all over the country. Let's keep going. Up to this point, we've talked about homes, families leaving, buildings changing, neglect setting in. But now we need to talk about something bigger. Because individual decisions did not destroy Michigan's historic places. Systems did. And once loss becomes systemic, it accelerates. It spreads. And it becomes very difficult to stop. Let's start with freeways. Because no single force reshaped Michigan cities more violently or more permanently. Freeways were sold as progress. Speed, efficiency, connection. They were framed as inevitable. But here's the part that often gets left out. Freeways don't just cut through land. They cut through neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods they cut through were rarely chosen at random. In Detroit, entire historic districts were erased to make room for highways. Brush Park lost blocks. East Jefferson was severed. Black Bottom was obliterated. Paradise Valley disappeared almost entirely. These weren't just buildings. They were social ecosystems. Churches, homes, businesses, clubs, communities. And once they were gone, they could never be rebuilt. But this didn't only happen in Detroit. Across Michigan, freeways sliced through Pontiac, Flint, Saginaw, Grand Rapids, Lansing, Muskegon. In smaller cities, the impact was even more concentrated. One highway could remove huge percentage of a city's historic core. And once those corridors were carved out, the surrounding neighborhoods began to suffer. Noise, pollution, isolation. Homes that survived demolition lost value. Families left, and vacancy spread. Now we need to talk about redlining, because freeways weren't the only tool. They were just the most visible one. Redlining was quieter, more bureaucratic, and just as destructive. In the 1930s, federal housing agencies literally drew lines on maps. Green areas were safe, yellow were declining, red were hazardous. And those designations determined who could get loans, who could refinance, who could invest. Historic neighborhoods, especially those with older housing stock or black residents, were disproportionately marked in red, which meant no capital, no repairs, no investment. Homes didn't fail, they were starved. This mattered deeply for historic houses, because old homes require maintenance, and maintenance requires access to capital. When owners couldn't borrow, they couldn't repair. When they couldn't repair, conditions worsened. When conditions worsened, the neighborhood was labeled blighted. And once a place is labeled blighted, demolition becomes easier to justify. Now add urban renewal, a phrase that sounds hopeful, but often wasn't. Urban renewal programs were designed to clear slums, but slum was rarely defined by architecture. It was defined by poverty. And poverty was often the result of very policies being used to justify clearance. Entire neighborhoods, many with solid housing stocks, were demolished to make way for parking lots, modern office buildings, government complexes, developments that never materialized, and what replaced them rarely matched what was lost. In Michigan, urban renewal hit hardest in cities that were already facing industrial shifts. Factories closed, jobs moved, population declined. Instead of stabilizing neighborhoods, renewal often removed the very fabric that held them together. And once people lose faith that their neighborhood will survive, investment stops. Why fix a roof if the block might be gone next year? There's another force that deserves mention: changing taste. This one is harder to quantify, but just as powerful. Mid-century America fell out of love with ornament. Victorian homes were seen as dark, heavy, old-fashioned. Modernism promised light, efficiency, clean lines. Entire generations were told that old meant inferior. And when taste turns against history, preservation becomes unfashionable. People don't rally to save what they've been taught to dismiss. So when you stack these forces together, freeways, redlining, urban renewal, disinvestment, changing taste, you don't get isolated loss. You get collapse. And that collapse was not evenly distributed. Historic districts with political power survived. Those without it didn't. Neighborhoods that organized early held on. Those that couldn't were erased. This is why Michigan's preservation map looks the way it does today. But here's the most important part of this section. Loss was not universal. Not everywhere gave in. Some neighborhoods resisted. Some cities adapted. Some homes survived because people refused to let them go. And that resistance, that refusal, is where the story turns again. In the next section, we're going to talk about survival. The neighborhoods that held on. The cities that chose preservation. The people who stayed when leaving would have been easier. Because Michigan's story was not just about loss. It's about resilience. And the places that survived are teaching us lessons we desperately need today. After everything we've talked about, the loss, the policies, the demolition, the quiet unraveling, it would be easy to believe that Michigan's story ends there, that the damage was too great, that the losses were irreversible, that what survived was simply accidental. But that's not true, because while entire neighborhoods disappeared, others held on, not because they were lucky, but because people made choices, and those choices matter. Let's start with the truth that often gets overlooked. Preservation doesn't begin with laws. It begins with people. People who decide, often quietly, that something is worth keeping. People who stay when leaving would be easier. People who fix one window, then one roof, then one porch, even when the block around them is struggling. Preservation rarely looks heroic in the moment. It looks stubborn. Across Michigan, survival followed a few recognizable patterns. Some neighborhoods survived because they were organized early. Some survived because their homes were slightly newer and remained fashionable longer. Some survived because they had residents with influence. And some survived simply because a handful of people refused to walk away. Let's talk about what that looked like. Even in Detroit, where loss was immense, not everything fell. Boston Edison is one of the clearest examples. Built largely between 1905 and 1925, Boston Edison benefited from timing. The homes were newer. The architecture felt more modern, for longer. The lots were large. The materials were exceptional. But that alone didn't save it. Residents organized. They fought for a historic district designation. They advocated for enforcement. They stayed. When others fled, they invested. And because of that, Boston Edison never fully collapsed. It bent, but it didn't break. Indian Village tells a similar story. Located on Detroit's east side, Indian Village was intentionally planned. Wide streets, consistent setbacks, architectural variety within cohesion. This mattered. The neighborhood had identity, and identity creates loyalty. Residents understood that if they didn't protect the district, no one else would. So they did. They documented homes. They pushed for designation. They enforced standards. And today, Indian Village stands as one of the most intactory 20th century neighborhoods in the Midwest. Not because it was untouched, but because it was defended. Then there's Palmer Woods. Palmer Woods survived for a different reason. Scale. These were estates, not just houses. Large lots. Setbacks that insulated the homes from street-level change. Higher income residents who could weather economic shifts. Palmer Woods didn't escape difficulty, but it never lost cohesion. It's a reminder that preservation is often tied to economics. An uncomfortable truth, but an important one. Now let's step outside Detroit, because preservation did not happen in one city alone. Ann Arbor offers a different model. Here, preservation was often driven by education. University presence created stability. Residents valued history. Civic engagement was high. Neighborhoods like the Old West Side weren't protected because they were elite. They were protected because people cared. They documented. They debated. They argued for scale and continuity. And the result is a city where historic homes remain part of daily life, not isolated artifacts. In Grand Rapids, craftsmanship became a form of defense. The city's identity was tied to making things well. Furniture, woodwork, design. That cultural value extended to homes. Historic neighborhoods like Heritage Hills benefited from early recognition. Residents understood that once craftsmanship is gone, it can't be replaced cheaply. So they fought to keep it. Heritage Hill became one of the largest urban historic districts in the country, not by accident, by intention. In smaller Michigan towns, survival often came down to scale. Everyone knew the houses, everyone knew the families. When a historic home was threatened, it wasn't anonymous. It belonged to someone's aunt, someone's teacher, someone's neighbor. That proximity created accountability. It didn't save everything, but it saved enough. What ties all of these places together is not architecture alone, it's continuity. These neighborhoods maintain enough residents, enough pride, enough belief that the place still mattered. And that belief, that intangible thing, is often the difference between collapse and survival. Here's another hard truth. Preservation often looks elitist from the outside, but in reality, it's usually fragile. It relies on volunteers, on unpaid hours, on people writing letters, attending meetings, fixing things themselves. Most preservation movements start small. One block, one house, one conversation. And over time, those small acts compound. Michigan's preservation story is not complete. It's ongoing, because even the neighborhoods that survived are not finished. They require constant care, and that brings us to the present. Because now, after decades of loss and resistance, something new is happening. People are coming back. Young families, artists, entrepreneurs, buyers looking for meaning, not just square footage. Historic homes are being rediscovered, and that rediscovery is creating a new chapter. In the next section, we're going to talk about revival. Not hype, not headlines, real revival. What it looks like when historic places are reoccupied, repaired, and reimagined. And what responsibility comes with that. Because survival is only the beginning. Stewardship is what comes next. Let's continue. Something changed in Michigan. Not all at once, not with a headline, not with a single project, but slowly, quietly, over the last couple of decades. People started coming back, not just to cities, to places, to neighborhoods with names, to streets with history, to homes that felt different the moment you stepped inside. And at first, it was subtle. One house restored, one block cleaned up, one family willing to take a chance. But those small decisions began to stack. And suddenly, historic homes weren't just surviving anymore. They were being chosen. Let's be clear about something. This revival wasn't driven by nostalgia. It was driven by dissatisfaction. People were tired of disposable places, tired of developments that looked the same everywhere, tired of houses that felt temporary. They wanted substance. They wanted materials that lasted, craftsmanship you could feel, rooms with purpose, neighborhoods with identity, and historic homes offered something modern construction often couldn't, a sense of belonging. In Detroit, that rediscovery became visible. Brush Park, once nearly erased, began to rise again. Not perfectly, not without tension, but deliberately. Historic facades were restored. New construction began to respect old scale. People walked streets again. Boston Edison saw renewed investment. Indian Village attracted buyers who understood stewardship. Palmer Woods remained a crown jewel. But this wasn't just Detroit. In Pontiac, historic homes, once written off, began finding new life. Buyers looked past outdated kitchens and saw proportion, layout, and potential. They noticed solid brick, original trim, thoughtful floor plans, neighborhoods designed for walking. Pontiac didn't need to reinvent itself. It needed to be re-seen. In Ann Arbor, historic neighborhoods continued evolving. Not as museums, but as living communities. Old homes adapted to modern life without losing their soul. In Grand Rapids, Heritage Hill became proof that preservation and growth are not opposites. And in small towns across Michigan, homes that once seemed too big, too old, and too difficult were suddenly being viewed as opportunities. Not flip projects, but commitments. Here's where I need to slow down and speak directly, not as a narrator, but as a realtor. Because this is the part most people don't understand. Buying a historic home is not the same as buying a modern one. It requires patience, curiosity, respect. You're not just purchasing square footage. You're inheriting decisions made decades ago. You're agreeing to learn how the house works, how it breathes, how it responds to seasons, and most importantly, you're agreeing to care. This is where revival becomes responsibility. When you buy a historic home, you're stepping into a chain. You didn't start it. You won't end it, but what you do matters. Do you preserve details or strip them out? Do you repair with intention or replace with convenience? Do you understand the neighborhood or treat it as a backdrop? These decisions ripple outward because historic homes don't exist in isolation. They shape streets, they anchor blocks, they influence value, both financial and cultural. I've sat across from buyers who were nervous, worried they weren't the right kind of person for a historic home. And here's what I tell them. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to care. Historic homes don't need saviors. They need stewards. People willing to listen, to learn, to slow down. And let's address something else honestly. Revival is complicated. It brings investment, but it can also bring displacement. It brings attention, but it can also bring tension. Preserving places must include preserving people. Otherwise, we repeat the same mistakes under a different name. True revival respects history, community, continuity. It doesn't erase the past to make room for a prettier version of it. This is why storytelling matters, because stories humanize places. They remind us that buildings aren't blank slates. They were lived in, loved, worked in, argued in, celebrated in. When we tell these stories, we raise the stakes. It becomes harder to demolish something once you know who built it and why. This is where the stories we keep fits. This podcast isn't about convincing everyone to buy a historic home. It's about helping people see value where they were taught to see inconvenience. It's about recentering Michigan's identity around its built environment, not as relics, but as resources. And here's the truth. Michigan's next chapter will be written by people who choose place over speed, people who choose meaning over trends, people who understand that where we live shapes how we live. If you're listening to this and you feel drawn to these stories, that's not an accident. You're already part of the revival. In the final section, we're going to step backwards and talk about legacy. What happens if we get that right? What happens if we don't? And what it means to consciously decide what kind of places we want to pass on. Because history doesn't survive on its own. It survives when someone decides it's worth keeping. Let's finish this together. At some point, every generation faces the same quiet question. What do we keep? And what do we let go? Not just in theory, not in headlines, but in the physical world, in the streets we walk, in the buildings we repair, or don't, in the places we decide are worth saving. Because whether we acknowledge it or not, every generation is a steward. We inherit a landscape shaped by people we'll never meet, and one day, someone else will inherit what we leave behind. Michigan's story has never been simple. We built fast, we grew bold, we reached higher than most places ever dared to, and when things changed, we struggled. We lost more than buildings. We lost confidence, continuity, faith, and permanence. But we didn't lose everything, because some places survived, and not because they were perfect, because someone chose them. Here's what I want to be very clear about. This series is not about mourning the past. It's about understanding it, because nostalgia without understanding is just decoration. But understanding gives us tools. It teaches us what kinds of neighborhoods last, what kinds of buildings adapt, what kind of decisions compound over time, and what kind of mistakes repeat themselves. When we understand why certain places thrive, we stop guessing about the future. Michigan's built history tells us something important. Places designed with intention age better. Neighborhoods built for people outlast those built for speed. Homes made with care invite care in return. And when we abandon those principles, we pay for it, sometimes for generations. This is why preservation is not about freezing time. It's about continuity. It's about allowing places to evolve without erasing what made them meaningful. A historic home doesn't ask to be untouched. It asks to be understood. I want to speak directly now to you, listening. You don't have to own a historic home to be a part of this. You don't have to live in a famous neighborhood. You don't have to know architectural terms. All you need is awareness, to notice when a building feels different, to ask what used to be there, to pause before accepting demolition as inevitable, to care, even quietly, because awareness spreads. And once enough people start paying attention, decisions change. This podcast exists because too many stories were never recorded. Too many homes disappeared without anyone asking who built them. Too many neighborhoods were erased without anyone listening to the people who lived there. We can't undo that, but we can stop repeating it. That's why this series isn't just about Detroit, or Pontiac, or any one city. It's about Michigan as a whole. Urban, suburban, rural. Because history doesn't belong only to places with recognition. It belongs to everywhere people cared enough to build something meaningful. This is also where you come in. This podcast is not a closed archive. It's a living one. I want to hear from you. If there's a house you've always wondered about, tell me. If there's a building you remember that's gone, share it. If there's a place that shaped you, even if you don't know why, that story matters. Because history isn't just written by architects and planners, it's lived by people. As a realtor, I work in the space between past and future every day. I see what happens when people choose stewardship over convenience. And I see what happens when places are treated as disposable. One path compounds value, not just financial, but cultural. The other leaves gaps. This series exists to help more people choose the first path. If you're new here, this is your invitation. Subscribe, stay curious, slow down. When you walk your city, look twice at the buildings that feel like they're trying to tell you something. And if you want to go deeper, read The Stories We Keep, our newsletter that we release every Thursday at 1 p.m. Watch Streets of History, Pontiac Pulse, and Homes of Michigan. Visit us at the historic Riker Building in downtown Pontiac. Explore the Foundations collection that helps us fund this work. Everything connects, because preservation doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in community. Michigan is not a place that forgot itself. It's a place that was forced to move forward before it had time to reflect. This podcast is that reflection, a place to slow down, to listen, to remember, and to decide, consciously, what kind of places we want to pass on. History doesn't survive because it's old. It survives because someone decides it still matters. History loves company, and these are the stories we keep.